aggregate supply shock. Suppose oil prices jump up. So this would be a change to our rho term. So inflation expectations stay at pi naught. That's, by the way, 1a. And what we can see is the initial effect is a lower level of economic output, y1a, and a higher level of inflation, pi 1a. But if we don't believe that the central bank is committed to its inflation target, we probably think it's going to be committed to lower unemployment. So notice unemployment's going up here because of the negative output gap. So if we believe that the central bank doesn't really care that much about inflation, and we think that it's going to have an expansionary monetary policy, what would happen to inflation expectations? Rational expectations should tell us that expected inflation should increase. And so if expected inflation increases, we have another upward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So the first shift is the price shock. The second shift is a change in inflation expectations. Notice in this case, economic output falls even further and inflation rises even more. Wow. A central bank with no credibility towards a nominal anchor, when faced with a negative short-run aggregate supply shock, ends up in the worst possible world. Much higher inflation, much lower economic output. This, by the way, was the situation in 1974, 1975. During that period of time, the first OPEC oil price shock quintupled oil prices. We saw a big jump up in inflation. Nobody thought that the Federal Reserve would respond by pulling inflation back down. In fact, everybody thought they were going to respond to the rise in unemployment. So inflationary expectations jumped. The curve went up, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted up again, even more inflation and deeper economic recession. And eventually, Paul Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve, and as you've read in your book and we've talked in class, decided that this was no longer an acceptable situation and had a huge monetary contraction to bring inflation way down. Now, what difference does it make if they have a lot of credibility in that negative shock? So in this case, again, we still start in general equilibrium. We're at the target inflation rate. The negative shock happens. Expected inflation is still at its target level. The economy moves to point B. Economic output has fallen to Y1. And inflation rises to pi 1. Actually, this doesn't look any different than what we've done before with adaptive expectations. The key is what happens next. So we've seen with adaptive expectations, expected inflation would move to pi 1. Short-run aggregate supply curve would come down, inflation would slowly retreat, economic activity would move back to potential output. But what happens here? We don't have adaptive expectations. We have well-anchored inflation expectations. Well-anchored. So inflation expectations are still at pi t. So the following year, the short-run aggregate supply curve comes right back to where it was. So in essence, you get a one-year blip or one time period blip in inflation as the price shock hits. And then you bring everything right back to where we were at the beginning. So everything works out quite nicely. We don't have ever higher inflation and ever falling economic output. Yeah?
So when it comes to the short shock that is like in oil, does the central bank have to actually do anything?
Nope. So the question is, when we have a short-run aggregate supply shock like this, does the central bank need to do anything if they have high degree of credibility? And the answer is no, they don't. Now notice when we did inflation targeting with adaptive expectations, to maintain the target, they needed to create a much deeper recession, contractionary monetary policy, and then they had to reverse it with expansionary policy after that. But here they don't need to do anything. The credibility that they have takes care of anything that the central bank would have to do. Now, how does the central bank actually establish credibility? So this is the key. How do we establish credibility? So there are three things that can happen. We can have inflation targeting, we can appoint inflation-phobic central bankers, or we can increase the central bank's independence, assuming that it actually wants to keep inflation at a low and stable rate. So we've already talked about inflation targeting. Again, it's important to recognize that if you're going to have an inflation target, you actually have to meet it over some period of time. You have to show the public that, yes, your commitment to the inflation target is actually being met. You have to have done something, probably something pretty nasty, in order to get the policy to be credible. This was the thing that Paul Volcker did in the early 1980s. He was willing to tolerate 10+% unemployment in order to bring inflation down. Once he did that, everybody said, oh my goodness, he's serious about doing this. And every Fed chairman since then has also kind of sworn allegiance to low and stable inflation. And when inflation's popped up, there have been periods of time when the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates. This chart shows not inflation, but rather expected inflation. And two things to notice, two time periods here. If we move away from the crisis, what you'll see is that on average inflation was about 2.4% prior to the crisis and about 2.25% since then. It's not absolutely stable, but the fluctuations are very, very minor, a quarter of a percentage point or more, or less, excuse me. So it appears as if inflationary expectations are very, very stable in the United States. Now, the second thing you can do is appoint a inflation-phobic central banker. So this is Paul Volcker, and this was the expression on his face when he was told that inflation was running at 12% per year. He was not a happy camper. And because he was not a happy camper, he was going to do something about it. Right? And this is very typical. Most central banks look for chiefs of central banks to be very anti-inflation. They have to have that kind of reputation. So even though Ben Bernanke came under a lot of criticism for quantitative easing and massively expanding the Federal Reserve's balance sheet and worries about how this was going to lead to higher inflation, he also made it very clear that he was committed to keeping inflation at their target of 2%. And so in order to convince people that Ben Bernanke, was serious about doing that, they always talk about well-anchored inflationary expectations and how they watch inflation expectations very, very closely. This is what they're looking at to see if there's going to be any breakdown in these inflation expectations. Now, one other thing I might point out about this particular chart. If you look at inflation over the last 5 years, you'll see that, expected inflation over the last 5 years, you'll see that it's running about 2.25%, 2.3%. But during that same period of time, actual inflation has been running at about 1.5%, maybe a shade lower. So expectations are actually higher, not only higher than the Fed's target, but also higher than actual inflation. And it's been higher than actual inflation for the better part of 5 years. So what's amazing to me about this is how inflation expectations haven't changed, even with actual inflation running lower. Now, of course, almost everybody believes inflation is higher than the actual inflation numbers reported by the government. I mean, surveys show us that. So that may have a lot to do with what these expectation numbers look like. The last thing that you can do is to have a very independent central bank, meaning a central bank that is, by and large, away from political pressure or political influence in terms of monetary policy. And so what this chart shows is here are the most independent central banks. Here are the least independent central banks. And this is this was a study that was done from 1973 to 1988. Now, if you look at the list of countries here, you'll see that they're all developed countries. So we're not mixing in developing countries with developed countries. They're basically European countries, Japan, and the United States. And what you can see is that the more independence they get, on average, the lower the inflation rate. The more independent, the lower the inflation rate. By the way, you might notice the one big exception to that is the United States. It's not that the Federal Reserve during this period of time wasn't independent. It clearly was independent. One of the problems, especially for the Federal Reserve during the 1970s, its primary commitment was not to inflation. They were willing to have higher inflation to have lower unemployment. Right? Some would argue that's that dual mandate problem. They have to worry about both. In the 1970s, middle 1970s, and in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when we had the big oil price shocks, right, you get high inflation and you get high unemployment. If you have a tilt towards the unemployment for your policy moves, chances are you're going to end up with somewhat higher inflation. And that's exactly what we see for the United States. So let me just remind you, exam number 3, 2 weeks from today, 11:30 to 2:30, Wheeler Auditorium. I'll talk more about this on Thursday, when we will also be doing course evaluations. So remember, you can go online to do your course evaluations now, or if you come on Thursday to do them, please be sure to bring an internet-enabled device so you can do that. And keep in mind that problem set number 6 is also due on Thursday.